Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Kineo and Towards Maturity webinar called Ready, Aim, Fire. Hopefully, during the next 45 minutes, what our aim is to explore a little bit more about the impact that we're having on learning and the things that the practical things that we can be doing or thinking about that will have a positive impact on the learning interventions that we have as organisations or as individuals within those organisations. Before we start, though, it's always good. As people starting to put their name and where they're from, just tell us a little bit about your weather. That would be great. So where are you from and what's your weather doing? I'm in Brighton and it's quite a pleasant afternoon considering the rain that we've had. Very British, I'm afraid. That's me all over. So hi, Vicky from Hampshire. I'm not sure what weather's doing in Hampshire. Jolly good. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. The people are there. Blue skies. Oh, excellent. Very good. Blustery. Belfast is bright and cold. It's good to know. Guatemala. I like the fact that we've got someone from Guatemala. That's very cool. Very cool indeed. So welcome from Guatemala. So we're gonna dive into the webinar now. As you can see, we want to try and make this as engaging and as interactive as possible. Those people who have been on webinars before know that some of the challenges of doing that when you're confined to a chat box. But please feel free to ask any questions or share any observations, and we'll do our best to pick those up as we go through the content. We're going to offer you some questions as we go, so we'll be looking for you to give some responses to that. So ideally, getting your views and getting your opinions, your experiences is really useful and really helpful to getting a little bit deeper into some of the content that we're talking about. So let me just introduce my colleagues who we're presenting with. I'll let people talk for themselves. So Jane, if you'd just like to give yourself a quick introduction, that'd be great.
Thank you, Jez, and hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am in Marlow and it's really sunny here. It hasn't been sunny until just about 10 minutes ago because we've had lots of hail, but that's where I am, on the river in Marlow, and it's gorgeous now. So as you can see, I'm Chief Insight Officer at Towards Maturity. If you haven't heard of us, we're all about evidence-based practice. We help people make better informed investments in learning and development, and we've been doing this for a while. We have, as far as we know, the largest data lake in the world to what's working and what's not working in the world of learning and organisational development.
Perfect. Thanks, Jane. And Jacob.
Hi, so I'm Jacob Funnell. I'm actually an independent digital marketing consultant. So I work with Kineo and a number of other clients in the learning and technology industry.
Super, brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. So as I say, we've got different perspectives to offer, different information to share during the next 45 minutes or so. Jane's going to talk very much from a perspective of Towards Maturity and always the great insight that they have to share based on their reams of research and data. Jacob's going to share with us a perspective from a marketing angle. I think it's very clear that the marketing have been ahead of the game in terms of the use of data for quite a long time. So we're hoping that we can look at some of that experience and start to explore some of the insight that they may well share as well. I'm the head of consulting here at Kineo. My role is to work with clients and work out with ourselves to support learning and to think about how we use digital technologies to improve the learning experience of individuals and support organisations achieve their goals. So I'm going to be talking as well a little bit from a client perspective, from some of the work that we've been doing recently. So these in some ways are the four key questions that we're hoping that we'll answer during our session, to a lesser or greater degree. But what we're trying to do is give you some practical insight into some of the things that we're seeing from data, from the research that we're doing, but equally some of the experiences that we're having direct with some of our clients and what our response is to that. So how are we thinking about how do we help organizations improve the impact of their learning through the use of data, through the use of better analysis of data, and basically through looking at exploring how that can inform and impact on learner behaviours through intelligent design in some ways. Not intelligent design with a big I and a big D, sorry. So a question, a very quick question. So what we'll do is we'll place this question up there. Please feel free to answer the question as we go. And as you're answering, I'm going to hand over to Jane, who's going to start to walk us through some of the core data that they've identified in this area. So please feel free to answer your question in the chat box. We'll be monitoring as we go, and I'm going to hand over to Jane.
Thank you so much, Jez, and please do make sure you tell us what your challenges are, because then we can tailor the stuff. You guys have given up an awful lot of time to be here, so we want to make sure it's as tailored for you as possible. Now, where I'm going to start is with some bigger picture stuff. So I mentioned earlier that we are leaders in evidence-based practice, particularly specialising in the learning and organisational development area. And the work that we've been doing is, when we're looking at the future of work, we have been seeing a shift from departments that are hierarchical, which are often called top-down, moving to eco-organisations, which is really interesting. And I'm sure there is a desire for lots of organisations to go this way. But ultimately, where we are today is most of us are still structural, or we're somewhere in between. And this is really interesting to understand, because what comes along with this is a power shift. And for us as experts in the field of learning and OD, it's really important to understand, how can we ride on the wave of ecosystems and organisations that are set up in this way? And how do we deal with, how can we ride on that wave, but how can we also deal with some of the challenges that come along with that? So I'm going to talk about the insight and where we've got to with our work. And as you know, if you do know Towards Maturity, this stuff is incremental, it keeps coming. So I'm going to share some insights that are new to the market as well, because we do a lot of work with Kineo, and I can already see a lot of people that I'm aware of, and as you know us, we will share, and I'd love to get your feedback. So keep those questions and feedback coming. So I mentioned that the world of work is shifting, that we're moving from top down to more ecosystem led. Now, what that means is that how people consume learning is changing. Now, when it comes to adult learning theories, there is a challenge with learning and development professionals. We often haven't kept up with how things are changing. And what I'm showing you on screen is that as organisations are becoming more eco, we also need to think about how we become more heutagogical and how we help people be more self-determined. Now, self-directed has been something that you may have heard a lot of. But in the research that we've been doing, we found that self-directed is not the answer to everything we need it to be. So if you haven't heard of heutagogy, please go and have a look at it. But it's actually self-determined, which will help us make sure that when somebody is looking for learning and behavioural change, is that although it's built on pedagogic principles, that we make sure that somebody is self-determined in what they do and ultimately has more of a chance of winning. So not self-directed, self-determined. So let me uncover this a little bit more. So we pick up something called learning intelligence. And if you're not aware of why we're called Towards Maturity, is that organisations that are more mature add more impact to business. So our model Towards Maturity is to track organisations that are having the most impact with the same challenges. So they're doing the same things, and these are not organisations that have more money, more resources, more IT, more anything. They just have a very different way of doing things. And they're often not the biggest either. And they're typically the top 10% of our studies. So if you look along the bottom of the screen of what you're seeing, there's 4 stages, so from stage 1 to 4. And this, our maturity model, splits into 2 halves, stages 1 and 2, and stages 3 and 4. So if we look at stages 1 and 2, if you're operating in those areas of maturity, you get little impact with the learning interventions that you do. You still get some impact, but it won't be impact at a organisational level that the organisation is looking forward to. It's much more transactional. So you can see some of the outcomes that get there. It's more of a surface level impact. Now, there could be many, many reasons for this, but these are the typical things we see. So you can give people access to knowledge, but it's not having a transformational impact and often what it's designed to have. If you are operating at stages 3 and 4, you have much more of a transformational impact, i.e. it's behavioural impact on businesses. So that's our maturity model. And if you're at stage 4, you have an impact on growth, transformation, productivity and profitability. And if you've heard me speak before, those are the critical levers of business. And quite frankly, the only things that are spoken about by executives, leaders, and in the boardroom. And if you're not talking in those 4 terms, then you won't be heard by senior leaders. But organisations that operate at stage 4 level of maturity are able to impact growth, transformation, productivity and profitability at least 10 times more than anybody else. And I'm going to talk to you about why in a minute. Now, what you're seeing on screen here is that we refer to these organisations as our top deck, the top of our study where they're getting more traction. They are by no means perfect, but they're doing a much better job than everybody else. So we can learn from these guys so the rest of us don't keep making the same mistake. What you can see here is 6 habits and characteristics that have come out of the data that really show what they do above everybody else. And the most important thing is the one in the middle, which is they're really clear that everything they do is focused on behavioural change. And those are the things that they measure. It doesn't mean they don't help with access to knowledge, but where they can give most support to the business is around behavioural change. And often what we're seeing with our data is people are getting confused by the 2. So there's access to knowledge, which is also critical to business, but it's not learning. We shouldn't design it to be, and we shouldn't pretend it to be. And it's also not what we're looking at here. We're looking at learning and behavioural change. So these are the 6 characteristics. There's a lot more things you can read. If you come to our site, these are all open source if you want to dig deeper. Now, I mentioned that those top deck, those high performing organisations that have really been able to impact the culture of their organisation have the impacts on growth, transformation, productivity and profitability. And these are just some of the areas from the latest research that we're launching at Learning Technologies this year. And under each of these 4, there are loads of different metrics that you can pull out. And here's just 4 that I've pulled out for you. And, you know, just to pick up one, because we haven't got time to go through everything, you know, faster rollout of change. We see these organisations having a 34% level above everybody else when it comes to rolling out change. So is it worth all the trouble of worrying about learning culture? From our perspective, it absolutely is. Because once you hit that, the gifts keep coming. But it isn't easy. This is challenging and complex stuff. If it was easy, none of us will be sitting here today. Now, what's going on then? Because if only 1 in 5 organisations are able to get to this stage, what's going on? So we've been digging into that. Now, the global spend, these figures are from Statistica. The global spend on learning and development is now over, in 2020, looking at Statistica this week, is over $400 billion, quite a way over $400 billion already. So quite a lot of money is being spent. And as you can see, that is going up and up and up and up. So spend is going up, investment's going up in digital, resource in L&D is going up, everything's going up. But sadly, impact is going in the opposite direction. So we can't continue as we are. And as you know, one of the reasons for putting on this webinar is that a lot of people are saying, well, what can I do to change this? And that's really important. So that's why we're talking today, because this stuff is not easy. Everybody's got a desire to beat the odds when it comes to impact, but sadly those odds are stacked against us unless you are a high-performing learning culture, because they are beating those odds. And in fact, the only study as part of our insight, the only group, those stage 4 people that are able to buck this trend. So there's something in what they're doing. So let's have a look a bit deeper. Now, high-performing learning cultures are led by L&D people and L&D teams and leaders of change and leaders of transformation that invest in themselves as well. Now, sadly, for everybody else, L&D are forgetting to invest. So if I pick one figure here, data analytics, as an example, which is the sort of brightest colour you see at the bottom of the screen, this is an area that should be going in the opposite direction. And it's not, because we are not comfortable with data in L&D. In fact, we're not even comfortable with Excel. And we've got to get comfortable, because data, like digital, needs to become our friend. Now, like anything, data out of context or data on its own is of no use to anybody. So as experts, we need to learn how to use multiple sources of data in order to help stress test and understand what we're doing is working. And sometimes when you look at data, it isn't nice. And you think, oh, I want it to tell me something different. But when you get comfortable with that, you can then see the good in that data, but you can also see that it's not worth carrying on as you are, and that you need to make slight tweaks in order to get closer to where you're trying to get to. But these figures are really worrying, and we are struggling to keep up with the pace of change, unless you are a high-performing learning culture. And if you take data, it's one of the things that's increasing most for these people. So like the trend on impact, people in high-performing learning cultures are thinking about themselves and what they need, as well as the audiences they look after and service. Now, self-determining is the thing that I mentioned to you, but let's talk about learner intelligence. And the more we know about people in our organisations, the more we can help them be self-determined. And the great news is to everybody, although there is a bit of nature, this stuff can be nurtured. And yes, all the slides will be available to you guys afterwards. That's no problem. But ultimately, self-determined can be nurtured, which is fantastic for us as experts. It can be nudged. And in fact, it doesn't need a lot of nudging, because my goodness, look at what's going on already. People are doing this for themselves. We in L&D are just not riding on this wave. In fact, we're often fighting against it. So let's ride on this waves. And a great quote on the left here from Kineo. About 68% of consumers say they would pick up skills faster if they were more self-determined. So it's fantastic. All of these things are lined up for us. Let's utilize this opportunity, a missed opportunity for most of us. Again, some more insights here from high-performing learning cultures. What do? Well, they create learning ecosystems. That will be digital things, non-digital things from outside, inside. But what they're doing is really thinking about the experiences. These figures speak for themselves. So let me just pick out two things here for you, because you're going to get all this insight anyway that you can reflect on. And you can share this with your leaders and teams and the people that you need buy-in from. Interestingly enough, they identify why people are not taking action. Because without reflection and application, something is not learning. It's just access to knowledge. If that's what you want it to be, fine. But if you're looking for behavioural change and performance impact, you have to make sure you know why people are not taking action? Is there a cultural reason for that? Is there a management issue for that? What is going on? The other thing just to bring here is I cannot not talk about the one in the middle, which is people having easy access. This is something that is at our hands to make life easier and more convenient for people. And high-performing learning cultures talk to people and find out what makes things easy for people to access. And you can see a significant gap here on the things that they focus on. These are just a few of the things, but you can see the pattern here. A little bit more to share with you. They're also much further ahead when it comes to well-being and diversity and inclusion. And again, 2 points here, focusing on soft goals that matter to people. And these are the kind of things that I know you guys would love to be doing more of and sharing with your organisations. Now, the only way that you can do more of the stuff that high-performing learning cultures are doing is by identifying your organisations. Now, if I take the stages of maturity, and it's really interesting here, but if you take people that are stages 1 and 2, and when I look at that stage 1, it's really worrying that they believe they're listening to learners, but they're clearly not. So 17% overall in stages 1 and 2, which is why they're getting a transactional sort of reply. But the difference really in stage 3 and 4 is also telling that high-performing learning cultures, 100% of them identify the minimum information that individuals need to take action. Getting back to the heart and the purpose of learning and why we as experts exist. Now that's it from me. I'm going to be around to answer some questions, but I'm going to hand back to Jez, who's going to introduce a poll to you. But keep those questions coming.
Hello everybody. So there's a poll that has popped up on the screen. And what would be great is if you could have a think about that as we're talking. And when we get to I'm just going to talk through the sorry, I've just got a bit of an echo in my headphone, so apologies for my distraction. It's gone now, so I'm sorted. The key thing is that I've just had a quick look through some of the comments from the question that we first posed, and in terms of what makes data useful for you guys, and why is actually doing it worthwhile. Where we are is that I've summarized it down into some key areas. That one of the key things for you guys is about quantification. How do you quantify what it is that you're trying to measure? So, excuse me, is the information meaningful? Is it actionable? Is it valuable for the business and the organization? If you can't quantify it, then it's going to be very difficult to measure the impact that you're having. But to do that requires you to be able to articulate that. And you need to be able to articulate that into business language, into ways that other stakeholders within the business understand. So it's all very well talking L&D speak, but the reality of it is that we need to be able to look at using KPIs which fit with wider business and organization needs. And therefore define our outcomes as part of a wider business solution and a wider business issues. It's not about identifying if a piece of training has just worked really well or not. That's part of the equation, but a bigger picture is where does it fit, and what are the other things that are going to help you inform that. And a key bit to doing that is engaging people. So that's a summary of some of the comments that you guys have come back with in result to that first question. Hopefully now that you'll see the poll and you'll be active on that poll. So I'm just going to move on with a couple of slides we've handed over to Jacob. And those, Jane talked about change and talked about the environment that we're operating in. And some people probably have seen this slide before, but for me, it's a really useful contextual piece. It's interesting to think about where we are in relation to technology and how technology is changing our attitudes and our ability to engage with knowledge, with information, but importantly, and I think the byproduct of this is, what do we do as an L&D community to understand that change and how people's learning is changing as a result of technology. If this chart is to be believed, if this graph is to be believed, we, as in our ability to adapt to that change is way behind, and technology will continue to grow while we're on a steady and slow incline, which I suppose in some ways it's a bit of and what are we going to do about it, which is a hard question to answer. What it does for me is it makes me even more aware that we need to think about how do we support our organizations understand how learners are behaving and interacting with information and knowledge, and the impact that that's having. And it's beyond now. We have to start to think about broader use of data, broader use of learner behaviors as part of our approach than just looking at individual training courses. If we move to the next slide, which talks from Josh Burston's point of view, if he is to be believed, the date which you can't see under my picture is 2020. So when it says learning in the flow of work, that's this year. We are now at the point where Josh Burston is saying the main driver of corporate learning is going to be learning in the flow of work. Now, I know, and you know, that that's not necessarily the case, but I think what it does do is it shows a trend. It shows a trend that's much more to this Husserlogical end of the spectrum around the use of individuals' use and engagement with knowledge and information, which creates a great problem for us in terms of how do we measure that, and how do we support that. Big questions. I don't necessarily have the answers for them today, but I think in terms of where we're headed, we have to start to think about thinking differently about learning, thinking differently about learners' behaviors, and thinking differently about how do we map, support, and engage people in learning processes. I'm going to hand over to Jacob, who's going to share some interesting pieces from a marketing perspective, which have parallels for us. Marketing are a bit ahead of the game and have gone through this process a good few years ago. So I think their thinking and their writing on it is a bit more down the line than our own. So Jacob, over to you.
Thanks, Jazz. We've got these two slides.
Sorry, my fault. I'll skip those and come back. Hand over to you. There we go.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that marketers have faced when we're trying to understand customer behavior, and also some of the ways that we've overcome these challenges, particularly when we're dealing with data. I think that there are some real parallels with what marketers are dealing with and what L&D professionals are dealing with. The core problem is we're dealing with a really complicated system. Customer behavior has so many inputs into it, much as learner behavior does. So if you think about the last thing that you bought, there are so many influences in that. It might be the branding of the thing, or your previous experience, what your friends think about it. And when it comes to measuring that, we also have a similar problem in that we have this decision to make between either having lots of best of breed measurement programs or databases, or whether we have a single hub for everything. And also, like L&D, we're under incredible pressure to justify investment in our activities, in particular in providing ROI figures. So the way in which marketers have helped solve these challenges is quite interesting, because we're used to having a lot of data. So if you think of something like Google Analytics, the amount of data that throws out is huge. And one of the things we've become increasingly savvy about is with metrics. So I've seen quite a lot of things in the chat about using metrics and trying to find metrics which are the best ones to measure the real things you want to be measuring. And often that's just a kind of a cultural thing. So in marketing, we're getting particularly savvy, I think, at interpreting metrics, seeing them in context. So a good example is something like a high bounce rate. So that's where someone lands on a page and then just leaves altogether without doing anything else. We've come to understand that sometimes someone just landing on a page and then leaving straight away is a good thing, if you think about looking for an address on a website or something like that. We're also becoming more just kind of culturally used to taking lots of information together from different systems and then putting them into visualization tools like Google Data Studio. And one of the kind of the major sources of inspiration, and I think it'd be a source of inspiration for anyone dealing with data, is data journalism. So if you have a look at things like 538, if you want to know about the best ways to tell compelling stories with data, then this is a fantastic source of inspiration. So it's a good thing to check out. Testing culture, that's something which I think a lot of people in businesses aspire to. A very simple example of that in marketing is something like when you send half of your traffic to one page and half of your traffic to another to see which one performs better. One thing I would say about this is it's rightly talked a lot about, this kind of testing culture, but it isn't a magic bullet. One survey found that only 17% of tests, so on web pages, actually find a significant result. So it's not a case that you can just start testing things and then get significant answers, significant information from them. The main thing is that testing helps dramatically reframe problems. So instead of it being a kind of a jousting between two professionals trying to prove whose professional opinion is the best, you can just put it to the test. And another thing is this kind of emphasis on process. So instead of looking at any individual test as the way that you find out the true answer of what's really working, we're moving more towards making sure we have a robust system of testing things, looking at that data, evaluating it, moving on to the next test. One thing I would say, and I think this is very relevant to anyone who's reporting metrics in any department in business, is this distinction between metrics and analysis. So in marketing, our core metrics are things like bounce rate or email signups or marketing qualified leads. These are the things you report on. These are the things that you need to show to management that you're having the effect that you want. But metrics aren't telling you the full story. They can't tell you everything that you need to know. They are often measuring just one thing in isolation. They're not telling you about correlations between interesting things. Some of the best work I've ever seen in marketing has been where you bring in specialists in analyzing data. So this is especially the case when you're trying to draw together data from multiple sources, which can be quite intimidating if it's not something you're especially used to. The core thing is to start with your question first. So make sure you've got a clear idea, what is it that I want to find out? And then using data analysis to help answer it, rather than seeing data analysis as this standalone source of insight. Your professional experience, your judgment, the questions which are most pertinent, and asking those clearly is what gives data analysis its power. Also, I would say that by working with specialists, you move outside the reporting capabilities of the tools that you're using, which can be a significant problem. And this is across the board. If any of you have a sciences background, you might be familiar with stats programs like SPSS or R. Their capabilities just absolutely dwarf anything you're likely to get in most business software. And so by having that willingness to talk to outside specialists and work with people who can draw together this analysis and put them in these very powerful tools, you can get incredible insight, incredible information that moves you way beyond just focusing on metrics. The final thing that I would say before handing back over to Jess is when it comes to dealing with large amounts of information, we need to move away from thinking about information and data as providing proof or disproof of particular ideas. I really recommend this book called Super Forecasting by Philip Tetlock. And he looks at the people who are the best in the world at predicting future events based on the evidence that they're taking in from whatever sources, from the news or from their professional experience or people they're talking to, whatever it is. And so they'll be incredibly good at answering questions like, will a particular political figure be in power in 2021, or what will the price of gold be in 10 years or whatever. These people who are exceptional at predicting the future are very good at incorporating lots of sources of data and using it to make small adjustments to their beliefs. So this is something which is not really part of our business culture around data. It's often like proving interventions. But if you want to make better decisions, then it's often best to take information in and use it to slightly adjust your confidence in things, going from being 80% confident in something to 85% confident, for example. So with all of that said, I'm going to hand back over to Jez.
Thanks, Jacob. That's great. So we've got the answers to the polls. I'm going to ask Jane to pop back on as well, and Jacob, if you want to join in, if there's any comments from your Jane. Looking at the answers from there, what are your thoughts about what you're seeing in terms of those poll results?
I think it's really interesting, and it's no surprise to me that we you know, we do collect a lot of data, but we don't know what to do with it, or we don't analyse it, or that most things from the poll are focused on the transactional side, which is often called happy sheets, as we say, because that's what the business are interested in. But where the holy grail is for us is on the other two. So looking at this transactional stuff, transformational stuff, the behavioural insights, we'd be much better to have less of those, the more. But this is very typical of what I see when I am, you know, talking and meeting with different groups of people from an L&D perspective, whether they are senior or not. So this is a very typical distribution, I'm going to call it, of data. So our poll is very typical of what I see elsewhere.
On mute, apologies, mute. The echoes for me as well, and I think I'm just going to flip back to the slide that I skipped earlier, because it does show some of this. We did a client survey a little while back, just to understand a little bit about client needs around impact and data, and what we found is that, like this, that most people say yes, it's really useful and we need to do it, we need to do more of it. Yet 80% of those people studied, again, it's in this box here, which people can't see under our faces, but 80% of those surveyed felt they don't have the skills necessary to do it. So therefore it makes it difficult. So I think that for me, the issue is that the transactional data is something that we probably feel more comfortable with. You know, we feel more comfortable with happy sheets. We feel more comfortable with that quite linear, quite straightforward, single source data. But the moment we start to look at multi-source data, we start to look at corroborating information on different data streams and different data sets, that's when, and understandably, you know, I'm not a data analyst, but it's like that our knowledge runs out and therefore we feel less comfortable. One of the key stats that came out for me from our survey was 50% of those respondents didn't actually use the data they generated. So half the people, you know, of the people that did do some evaluation and did some data harvesting, if you like, 50% of them didn't really take it beyond that. So we've got the data is available to us, and some of the quality of that data might not be there, and, you know, our ability to find and extrapolate the right data might not be there. But the problem is potentially is we don't really know what to do with it once we've got it. Which I think is, you know, is sort of a classic issue within learning and development when we start to talk about changes in technology and our approaches and behaviours to it. Any thoughts, guys, on that? Jane, anything from you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It'd be good in the chat, those 14% of people that are saying they are making decisions based on both transactional behavioural insights. Well, you know, tell us and the rest of the team what you're doing. But ultimately, people often say to me, and I just went through some of the challenges people are having is, well, you know, what do I look at? Where do I have? And we can tie ourselves up in knots for this. And what I would say to people, if you want to start anywhere, then look at speed to capability and quality to capability. So don't worry about measuring 100 things, and maybe do that with just people that are new to your business, which is typically around 30% of your workforce. Just look at that, you know, in an area, because it's very rare, again, that I can even find, because capability is different to competence, you know, or skills. It's not about having those things. There are people capable within their first 100 days joining an organisation. Now, I'm not saying capable to 95% of their job profile, but I'm saying, number one, where do you want them to be? Now, the only way to measure that is to know where you want them to be at 100 days. So it's those kind of places that you can start, but it's very rare to find L&D professionals that can even give you speed and quality to competency rates, capability rates. So if you want to measure behaviour and you want to start somewhere, start there. But the 14% that we've got with us, you know, tell us what you are up to, because if you're already doing it and you're getting success and you're making decisions on it, tell us what you're measuring, because you know, it's always good to know people that are already using this kind of insight and data and making decisions on it. and how's that working for you? So tell us in the chat. But that would be my advice. Just start with one thing, get comfortable with that, and build from there. I found by doing that when I was at Marks and Spencer and looked after 100,000 employees across the world, in 1 year alone, we saved £12 million, because what gets measured gets managed. And the great thing about it was the business wanted to own it, so I could stand back. We just helped facilitate and guide that happening in the future. That is the position of expertise and power we need to be in as learning and development professionals, but we'll never be able to hand that baton over if we don't help people do it.
Thanks, Jane. I think Jeff's asked a really interesting and great question. So what data do we already have that we don't know how to use? And I think it's a really good point. And my observation is that we have access to lots of different sorts of data, and there's probably more data that we don't have access to, which would be valuable. But it's how do we utilize that? So how do you use performance data from individuals, for example? So how, you're looking at an individual person's performance profile. How does that relate and correlate to their learning output? Are we able to bring those two different streams of data together and draw some correlations and patterns around certain learning inputs and certain performance outputs at an individual level, or at an organizational level, or at a team level? That's the sort of data that is there. It's within the business, but how do we actually use it and engage with it? And I think some of it's about ability to do that. Some of it's about the technologies to do that. Someone before mentioned, how do we use XAPI in this process? And I think, again, XAPI is a great tool. It's a great tool at streamlining data. It's a great way of bringing different sources together under one roof. But again, the question in my mind is, what do we do with it, and how do we utilize it to make actionable insight that we can make decisions on going forward? I'm mindful of the time, so I'm just going to push on in terms of the content that we've got to go through. Please keep going with the comments on them. If we don't get a chance to respond to them during the session, if there's questions there, Jane, myself, and Jacob will come back to you on that. So next slide. This comes from some of the work that we've done and some of the conversations that we've been having with some of our clients around what's important to them around managing how do they get the insight that they need to impact on performance of their learners. And in some ways there's two camps. One camp is to say, as many of you have done, is to look at it at a strategic level. So, okay, so this is learning about how do we impact on broader business performance? How do we look at ROI? How do we say that if we've done learning input A, the result is B, and that gives us business performance C, which is really a great question to ask, and is something that we could work towards doing. For me, one of the key things from that is how is learning and development, how easy is it to access the data and the information that's needed to prove those points? Firstly, to identify identify what it is that we're trying to solve in the first place, or the issues we're trying to address in the first place, or the changes we're trying to make, and then making, as a result of making that change, what will we see as the output within the business, versus a bottom-up approach, which is much more program specific, beyond happy sheets, looking at actually learner experience and individual performance, thinking around how do we look at defining and developing learning interventions which hit the mark appropriately for learners, and what can we do in terms of our design to support learners better, and make sure that the interventions that we are having are hitting the mark with those individual learners. And in some ways it's about saying, well, there's a bit of a rabbit hole problem here, is that we sort of get lost on the ROI thing, and actually some of the things that we can control and the data that's easily available to us is much more focused on individual learning outputs and the support that we're driving. So what we've tried to do is, I mean, again, it's thinking about Kirkpatrick, it's thinking about Thurmaier, it's looking at those different models of behaviour and different models of thinking around evaluation, and thinking, well, what can we do, and where does the data exist to help us actually create that insight. We have an understanding of what it is that we need to do, but what can we actually physically do towards doing that? And if you think about learner experience through to impact an organization, when we talk about improving what it is that we do and how it is that we deliver it, most people go straight to ROI. Which is, of course, the bit of the holy grail, and it proves our existence. However, there's things that we can do before we get to that point. And my question and challenge to people is always: are we doing things around? Do we really fully understand the learner experience? Do we fully understand the learning that individuals are having, and how are they applying that? And have we asked those questions? And do we really get how our learning is actually having an impact on that? If we can't, it's very difficult to get straight into looking at impact on a more macro level. So how we're thinking of it is that what we're trying to do is break it down into different data sources, asking different questions. So the first step for us has got to be about learner experience, and how do we do that, and how do we improve learner experience, and then move forward. And simply, it's about asking a clear hypothesis. What is it you're trying to do? What question are you asking as a result of this training? What will change as a result? What intention do you have? Have you articulated that in a way which clearly defines what those clear outcomes and behaviours will need to be? What will you see as a change? So if we think about looking at, then we'd look at what data exists. So it's about saying, well, what data will help us prove those points? So are we looking to the learner engagement in terms of a piece of e-learning? Are we looking at the responses of learners to a particular intervention? Have they changed their behaviours as a result of that? And how do we measure that, and how do we prove that? So are we looking at 360-degree feedback tools? Are we looking at anonymized individual click data and making sense of that? What's going to give us the answer to the hypothesis? What data is there, and what data is available to us? And what technical support can we have to deliver and change that? Because at the end of the day, without us looking at some form of technology to support us in that process of aggregation and analysis, it's going to be very difficult for us to do it, unless, of course, we all go around start to invest in data analysts, which I don't necessarily see. Maybe that is the future. Maybe that is the future of HR and future of learning, is that we do look at employing focused data analysts who will be looking at various data sources and ways of doing it. In the meantime, what are some of the more pragmatic steps that we can take to move towards analysis and insight? And if we're not able to answer the questions towards the bottom end of that step list, we're not going to get to a point where we can start to impact and inform what ROI is. So for us, it's about looking at it, incorporating it into design, and thinking about what can we do when we're thinking about a piece of, if I'm going to talk about e-learning, talking about a piece of e-learning, what are the tools that are available to us to start to have, which will have a positive impact on an individual's learning and the behaviours that they exhibit. We're working towards creating an automatic tool that will help us understand this, and using the data that is naturally occurring as a result of an individual's activity on a piece of e-learning, which will start to give us greater insight than just how long did they spend on the course. We will start to be looking at using pre and post testing as part of retention. We'll be starting to think about introducing more formative questions throughout a piece of learning to start to craft some understanding around learning itself, looking at aspects of how to introduce spaced rehearsal as part of that process. So I'm going to close there with a question. So we have one final question to pose to the group, and then I'm going to bring Jane and Jacob back in to help answer that question. And also, if people would like to either comment, or if people want to come off mute and comment as well verbally, then very welcome to do so. So Jane, just as people gather their thoughts, are there any highlights from you that you'd like to share?
Yeah, and I've just been looking at the questions, and I really do want to respond to a couple of questions, particularly coming from Jeff and Michael. So 2 things about high-performing learning cultures. The first one is, I just can't give the list to you. It wouldn't be professional, and also it wouldn't be helpful, because that it's not about just saying, oh, because Marks and Spencer, who was a high performing learning culture, which is why I'm in the job I'm in today, because what M&S do it may be very different, and their needs would be very different to what you need. So we have to make sure we're not trying to put square pegs in round holes. But if you were a high performing learning culture, you wouldn't like me just giving out your information either. So we'd have to agree with them. But my advice to you is to look at all of these 3 case stories we've got, which tend to be from organisations that are in that space. So that gives you a clue. The other question that I want to mention is that when we think about behavioural change, the place that we go wrong and measuring this and bringing out insights and metrics is 2 things. The first one is, today only 47% of us analyse the need before recommending a solution. And this is often where we go wrong. So we also try and analyse a training need rather than a performance need. Now, if we were to start from that place, which is where 100% of high performing learning cultures do, we would find that it may not be a training intervention, a learning intervention that is required in the first place. But also, we would also be saying to people, well, if we were to do X, Y, Z, what would be different? What are we trying to change? Are we trying to grow, transform, be more productive, more profitable? Now, if you're looking anywhere out of one of those 4, then you won't find what you're looking for. And this has to be done in partnership with the business. And the thing that we forget as L&D is to go, well, what is going on now? Now, if it's completely new, that's different as well. But if we're often trying to reskill or upskill, we have to look at, well, what are we doing now? And what are we expecting to change by when? There's no point in starting anything until we can understand, it's coming back to this hypothesis. What are we trying to change? And also L&D have to remember, and high performing learning cultures are absolutely on the money with this, is they don't measure everything themselves. With me, it has to be in partnership with the business. It should not become an industry. And if the business don't want to do it in partnership, then hence there's your first problem, because it's not us that is responsible solely for productivity or profitability. It's the difference between sales and profitability. Think about it in that way, is that just getting money in is great, but if it's not profitable money, then there's no point. And just by doing something more and more doesn't mean it's successful. So we need to stand back a bit and start with the end in mind, would be my advice. Now, depending on what you're looking, you would then adapt what behavioural change you're trying to measure. So it isn't just a standard list of stuff. And again, that's where we go wrong. It has to be adapted, like Jacob was talking about in marketing, depending on what you're trying to change. Now, some things might be similar because you're in a similar business and you're looking for particular levels of productivity, as an example. But in L&D, we often don't even know productivity rates in the first place. So we have to start with the end in mind. I'm just responding to a couple of those questions to make sure we do that. Apologies, Jez. I just wanted to make sure that people didn't feel that we had picked that up. But again, if you do want more from me, it is embarrassing, Jeff. I completely agree with you. And that's the other thing about us. We often tie ourselves up in knots because we don't start in the first place, right in the first place. We've got to be really brave and courageous now. We can't continue as we are. And I know you guys are experts, so let's do this together. But if there's any other questions for me or you want to go through Kineo, then please let me know. Jeff, Jez, back to you and Jacob.
Thanks, Jen. I think from my point of view is that it's a journey, and I think although there is some really great pockets of great work that's going on and individuals are working hard to try and crack this problem, I've not come across yet any one organisation that's doing it. There's several of our clients who are investing quite heavily in looking at upping the resource levels around data and how to use data better, and using the power of their organisations to do it. The reality of it is not everyone can do that, and I think Becky's just asked a question about compliance, and it's like, well, yes, compliance-based learning is really important, and what we're finding is that people still want to understand maybe the impact of compliance is in one level is more simplistic. If the answer to the question that you're trying to ask is have X number of people, how are they responding to phishing emails, for example, and data security? So do you see data security instances dropping as a result of doing that training? It's a relatively simple question. The data that goes about actually proving that is potentially quite complex. So it depends on what level. Do you want to measure the actual training itself and look at the impact the training has had on the learner, and is the training good and well designed and well structured? Or actually are you starting to broaden the question out to say, has the training met its perceived and its ultimate goal, which is clearly where the organization wants to go, but it's probably harder to do. And that's when we start to get into multi-source data. And how skilled are we at actually being able to pull those different sources of evidence together to be able to prove what could be a relatively simple question? And I don't think there's an easy answer to that. We're on a journey. We're learning about it. We're trying as a community, I think, to grapple and to do it better. And there's a recognition that it's part of the evolution of learning as a whole. Jacob, anything for you to add?
Yeah, so one thing I would add to this is, as organizations, we are actually often in quite unique sets of circumstances. So there's often not like a one-size-fits-all answer to these questions. We talk about something like compliance learning. You're going to have many different kind of instantiations of that depending on the topic at hand. And I think it's the same thing with us in marketing, that there are some things where the thing to be measured is in many ways going to be informed by your professional experience. And I think this is one of the things where kind of data and professional judgment go hand in hand, because when it comes to questions like what will change if this thing is successful, what sorts of things will change? That's the sort of thing as humans we're incredibly good at asking. We're incredibly good at understanding the causal relationships between things. That's something that you won't get from raw data alone. And so that's how you really kind of leverage your professional experience. You really ask those questions clearly and think about things clearly, and ask as Jane was saying, instead of seeing something like a training need, you start looking at the actual change that you need to see. I also think that when it comes to figuring out measurements of things, there's so much to be said about just trying to measure things in the first place. You learn so much by just going ahead and trying to do this and making this part of your culture. You may end up changing the things that you're measuring, but you massively learn by doing. It's such a complex field.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Jane. I think we will close it at that. So thank you, everybody, for your engagement and your comments and your questions. We will do a bit of a filter through that and highlight any of those questions that we've got, which we feel that we've not answered, or we feel there's some evidence or there's some answers that we could provide you with. We'll give them a look, and we'll put them out when we send copies of the slide deck and a copy of the recording out to folk. So again, thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, days, evenings, mornings, wherever you're dialing in from. Thank you, Jane, again for your great support and engagement on this. Thank you, Jacob, for your support and time. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye.